They treated me like furniture for 10 years. But tonight, I decided to stand at the head of the table. The crystal chandelier above the Tidesbury dining hall didn't just glow, it observed. Like it had been quietly recording every moment I'd been overlooked for the past 10 years. Light scattered through thousands of hand-cut prisms, breaking into sharp angles across the faces of people who had shared meals with me for a decade without ever truly acknowledging my presence. I stood beside the long mahogany table, gripping a heavy ceramic salad bowl, my fingers pressed so tightly against the cool surface that they blanched white. The air carried the scent of toasted pine nuts and imported balsamic, but my mouth tasted only of restraint, the kind that builds when anger has been swallowed for far too long. My mother-in-law Beverly never lifted her gaze. Her attention was fixed on a guest's vintage Patek Philippe, her smile polished and precise, matching the diamonds resting at her collarbone. With a lazy motion of her manicured hand, the same gesture she reserved for staff, she flicked her wrist toward the far side of the room. "Just set it on the sideboard, Alina," she said smoothly, without even looking at me. The room froze. Forks hovered mid-air. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. 12 carefully curated guests turned their attention toward me, some uncomfortable, others detached, as if this moment was simply part of the evening's entertainment. I felt Julian's gaze most of all. My husband, the man who had watched me manage billion-dollar infrastructure projects, command teams of thousands, and deliver results under impossible pressure. Yet now he stared down at his plate, suddenly absorbed by a single stalk of asparagus, silent, passive, absent. I didn't move toward the sideboard. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. Instead, I stepped forward past the guests, past the whispers, and walked straight toward the head of the table. I moved past the silent guests and placed the bowl directly in front of Beverly. It landed with a sharp, intentional sound, just enough to send a ripple through the wine in her glass. I met her eyes, calmly removing the role I'd played for years, the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law that had clung to me like a second skin. "You're right, Beverly," I said evenly, my voice cool and unwavering. "Staff shouldn't dine with the guests." I paused. "But the owner should." The air shifted, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I continued, "I own this entire resort. Every stone, every bottle in the cellar, including the chair you're sitting in." Silence swallowed the room. If you've ever been made to feel small by people who were supposed to treat you like family, you're not alone. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read every story. I didn't wait for Beverly's response. I didn't need to see her hand freeze around the glass, or notice the way Mackenzie's expression collapsed in disbelief. The shock in the room was heavy, almost tangible, but I was already moving. I turned and walked out. My heels struck the limestone floor with steady, deliberate rhythm, not rushed, not dramatic, precise, like the final seconds before a system shuts down. Most people would have stayed. They would have argued, demanded explanations, or waited for an apology that was never coming. But I've spent a decade designing complex systems, infrastructure where failure isn't emotional, it's mechanical. You don't fix a derailment by yelling at the wreckage. You clear the track, you isolate the fault, and you redirect the power. By 12:03 a.m., I was alone in the library. The glow of my laptop was the only light as the estate pressed in from the darkness outside the windows. Inside the digital records, though, everything was clear. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. For years, I had been the unseen framework holding their version of family together. I solved the problems no one wanted to acknowledge, covered costs they quietly ignored, absorbed expenses they passed off as tradition. I wasn't a guest. I was the foundation. And foundations don't ask for permission, they decide what stands and what doesn't. They moved through the halls like I wasn't there, a presence that provided stability, without ever being acknowledged. My fingers moved across the keyboard with calm precision, not rushed, not emotional, the speed of someone who already knew where every vulnerability was hidden. I logged into the Tidesbury guest management system, the operational core of the entire resort. 6 months earlier, through a holding company no one bothered to investigate, I had quietly acquired the debt that was suffocating this place. While Beverly obsessed over gala seating charts and invitation lists, I was finalizing the documents that made me her landlord. I glanced at my watch. Heart rate 72 beats per minute. Steady, focused. Emotions weren't necessary here. I pulled up the Vance family's permanent resident credentials, unrestricted spa access, private chef privileges, and the legacy exemption that kept them living rent-free in the North Wing while the resort hemorrhaged money. I selected the entire file. One click. Access revoked. Next, the beach club database. Beverly's preferred private cabana, the one she treated like a personal estate. was flagged for maintenance review due to structural concerns. It wasn't symbolic, it was accurate. Some systems fail slowly, others collapse quietly long before anyone admits it. I continued. Network permissions updated, biometric access reset, master keycard authorizations revised. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, the Vance family wouldn't be confused guests or overlooked residents. They would be unauthorized occupants in a property that no longer recognized their credentials. Inside the library, my laptop cast a cool blue glow, the kind of dawn that only appears after a night of recalibration. The accounts were no longer balanced, and I was the only one authorized to correct them. To them, I had always been underestimated, the quiet one, the practical one, the wife with the sensible shoes and the unremarkable job somewhere in tech. They never asked what I actually did, and I never corrected their assumptions. They were busy discussing appearances, labels, impressions, surface-level success. I worked in systems, load-bearing structures, data integrity, failure prevention. While they debated luxury and perception, I designed infrastructure that moved millions of people every single day. While Beverly quietly sold off possessions to keep accounts active, I engineered digital frameworks for projects valued in the hundreds of millions. I didn't invest in symbols. I invested in land, in leverage, in a $14 million acquisition fund. For 11 years, I had been the unseen support, holding everything together. I quietly covered expenses no one wanted to acknowledge, stabilized emergencies before they became public, protected reputations when credit limits failed and appearances mattered more than reality. I never asked for recognition, but I kept records. And now, for the first time, the system reflected the truth. I had covered his excesses more times than I could count, especially when his vintage car hobby went beyond what his accounts could tolerate. Not because he asked, but because I didn't want him to face his mother's cutting commentary. I did it because I believed marriage meant reinforcement that you protect the people you choose. What I failed to see was this. They didn't value me. They valued the convenience I provided. Julian was the most difficult variable in my assessment. At those dinners, I used to watch him sit perfectly still while his mother reduced me with carefully chosen words. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He wasn't unfaithful. He wasn't aggressive. He was absent. Looking at him now from across the library, I finally understood the pattern. He wasn't neutral, he was conditioned. Beverly hadn't simply raised a son. She had constructed a psychological enclosure around him, reinforcing it slowly until independence felt dangerous rather than natural. When someone grows up learning that disagreement is punished and approval is conditional, silence becomes survival. Julian didn't stay quiet because he agreed with her. He stayed quiet because confrontation felt unsafe. Fear, obligation, guilt. They formed a fog so thick he became a spectator in his own marriage, waiting for permission to exist fully. Permission that was never coming. And as the server logs scrolled across my screen, something finally became clear. I could not remain inside that structure anymore. My empathy had been extended for years without return. The account was depleted. I had been the quiet investor in their version of family, funding it emotionally, financially, invisibly, while receiving nothing back. I closed my laptop. For 11 years, I had been the unseen operator, maintaining systems, preventing collapse, keeping everything functional while remaining unacknowledged. But support systems aren't meant to disappear quietly. When they withdraw, the entire structure feels it. The next morning, the estate felt different. The air was tight, heavy with attention. I was in the kitchen pouring a cup of black coffee when I heard the familiar, deliberate tap of Mackenzie's heels. She wasn't alone. Her phone was mounted on a gimbal, a ring light already glowing, her focus fixed on content, not context. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't acknowledge the previous night. In her world, if something wasn't posted, it didn't exist. She turned the camera toward me as I rinsed my mug. "And here we have the assistant," she said brightly into the lens, slipping into that performative tone she used for her hundreds of thousands of followers. Captured in her natural environment, she tilted her head, smiling. "Point of view, when your brother's wife claims she owns the place after one too many brunch drinks, isn't she charming?" She wasn't just mocking me. She was packaging my humiliation for engagement. This was how the Vance family operated, extracting value. They extracted labor. They extracted silence. And now, they were attempting to extract dignity. My phone chimed. The family group chat. Beverly had pinned a message to the top, visible to everyone, regarding Elena's emotional display last night. It read, "We believe stress and elevation may have contributed to temporary confusion related to her work project. Please respond with patience and kindness." Julian and I have chosen to overlook the situation for the sake of tonight's gala. I read it twice. In a single message, she had reframed documented ownership as instability, replacing facts with narrative to preserve her hierarchy. This wasn't denial. It was strategy. She wasn't just rejecting reality, she was rewriting it. And that's when I understood something vital. People like Beverly don't argue with the truth. They try to bury it. I watched Mackenzie through the chrome reflection of the espresso machine. She believed she was directing the scene, that I was just background, another prop in her carefully curated day-in-the-life narrative. I took a slow sip of coffee. The heat steadied me. Anger is inefficient. It flares quickly and leaves nothing useful behind. I was shifting to something far more durable. Execution. My phone vibrated again. Not the family thread this time. An encrypted message from Ethan, the property manager I had quietly retained 3 months earlier. Management files finalized. Legal counsel is positioned at the gate, standing by for your directive. The management office was removed from the spectacle of the guest wings, glass, dark oak, silence, a place designed for decisions, not appearances. When I entered, Ethan didn't rise with a polite smile. He slid a heavy leather binder across the desk. The holding company is now the sole owner, he said evenly. Title cleared and recorded at 4:02 p.m. yesterday. I opened the binder. The pages told a story numbers never lie about. For years, Beverly had treated the North Wing as a private boarding house, collecting maintenance contributions from friends that never reached resort accounts. Mackenzie had been hosting branded events in the grand ballroom, racking up over $11,000 per event in staffing, catering, and security, all charged to accounts that didn't exist. The resort absorbed the loss. I traced a line of red ink down the balance sheet. It's not hospitality, I said quietly. It's extraction. I allowed myself a brief projection, a version of my life where I hadn't acted. 10 years forward, still shrinking myself, still smoothing conflict, still existing as an accessory to someone else's last name. If I hadn't taken control, I wouldn't have just lost a house. I would have lost myself. This is a full restructuring, I said, my tone measured and final. I want formal notices issued for every Vance family suite. No exemptions. No legacy arrangements. Ethan nodded. If they can't produce verified payment records for the last 3 years by tomorrow morning, I continued, they're unauthorized occupants. He didn't blink, but then he slid another folder across the desk. Vance Family Trust. Something else surfaced, he said. Inside were transfer records. 6 months after Beverly's husband was buried, $900,000 earmarked for tax stabilization had been withdrawn. The signature was jagged, forced. She forged it, I said calmly, and routed the funds through resort operating accounts, disguised as consulting fees paid to shell entities she controlled. Ethan exhaled slowly. That elevates it beyond mismanagement, he said. It's federal exposure. Julian's digital authorization appeared on the secondary approvals, whether he understood it or not, whether he questioned it or not. His name was there. They're not just losing access, I said, closing the folder. They're losing protection. This was no longer a family conflict. It was documentation, paper trails, consequences. That evening the gala unfolded exactly as planned. Silk dresses, champagne flutes, borrowed status polished to a shine. Beverly stood at the center, radiant, confident, unaware that every pillar holding her world upright had already been removed. And the lights hadn't gone out yet. Beverly stood at the center of the room, her glass lifted high, basking in admiration from guests who had no idea they were sipping wine purchased with falsified authorizations. To heritage, she declared, her voice echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. To the Vance legacy as enduring as the cliffs beneath us. I didn't wait for applause. I stepped onto the dais. I wasn't wearing the navy dress they expected, the one designed to blend in, to disappear. I was wearing a charcoal silk suit, custom tailored, the kind worn by women who finalize deals or end them. I had packed it for this exact moment. The room fell silent. Beverly's smile remained, but her eyes hardened. Alina dear, she said lightly, you've had enough attention for one evening. Please sit down before you embarrass Julian further. I didn't sit. I reached for the microphone. The brief feedback cut cleanly through the room. The Vance legacy, I said calmly, my voice steady and unshaken, isn't built on cliffs. It's built on $900,000 in falsified authorizations and over $100,000 in unpaid property taxes. Obligations I resolved this morning. A pause. And as of yesterday afternoon, the ground beneath this narrative no longer exists. I removed a folder from my portfolio. Inside, formal notices, transaction summaries, verified audits. I handed the first page to Beverly. Her composure cracked as her eyes scanned the figures. "What is this?" she whispered. "That," I said clearly, ensuring every guest heard, "is your formal notice to vacate, and those documents detail the financial misrepresentations that have been routed through this property's accounts. Accounts that now belong to me." Julian stepped forward, his voice strained. "Alina, stop. This isn't appropriate. We can discuss this privately." I looked at him, not with anger, but clarity. "We've been private for 10 years, I said quietly. "You watched me clear tables. Now you can watch me clear the property." I turned back to the room. "The Vance family residency is terminated, effective immediately. Security is already positioned at the north wing. You have 30 minutes to retrieve personal belongings. Anything remaining furnishings, assets, artifacts will be secured and liquidated to offset outstanding balances." Mackenzie cried out, her phone slipping from her hand and striking the marble floor. The screen finally went dark. Beverly looked around at friends, patrons, peers, and saw only the reflection of her own exposure. Her posture wavered. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. 30 minutes, I said evenly. Support staff doesn't wait, and neither do I. I stepped down from the dais and moved through the parted crowd. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't minimizing myself. I wasn't apologizing for presence. I was no longer accommodating a structure that depended on my silence. The estate is quiet now. The constant demands have been replaced by ocean wind and open space. Julian left with his mother, still unable to detach, even as the consequences followed. The North Wing is under renovation. It's becoming a creative residency, a place for architects, engineers, and builders, people who contribute instead of consume. This morning I sat on the cliffside with a cup of coffee and opened an old spreadsheet. Names, numbers, years of imbalance. I didn't feel regret. I felt resolution. A complex system, finally corrected. I selected the entire directory, and I deleted it.